I'm here to talk about library discovery tools and specifically open access. Actually, it turns out I was going to sort of go into lots of details about new and exciting forms of scholarly communications, but I realized that open access and discovery tools is quite a handful anyway, so I thought I'd focus on that. And I'm going to start back in 1999. It was in 1999 that some 80 academic library leaders gathered in Keystone, Colorado, which you can see the ski hill here, for the first ARL OCLC Strategic Issues Forum. Was anyone at that by any chance? That was a long time ago now. They talked a lot about web portals. Do you guys remember that terminology, which were a really big deal at the time? They concluded that if the research library was going to really have a meaningful presence on the web, we needed one of these portals. And they came up with the concept of library.org, and we're going to see what that actually looks like in a minute, which would serve as a place. Basically, it was like a single search box that kind of had these services sort of wrapped around it. A year later, some reports started to come out. Actually, it was in 2001, one of which really predicted the sort of the single search option that we're all really familiar with today, but this was back over a decade ago now. At the same time, a white paper from this very happy-looking fellow, Jerry Campbell, former dean of University of Southern California Libraries. I think he was CIO as well. He wrote that without doubt, the need within the academic community for a scholars portal is high, and the capacity to develop it is resident in ARL, OCLC, Library of Congress, and other agencies. There's also no doubt that today represents a fleeting moment of opportunity to engage the effort. I think he was right there. I think he sort of saw that the vendors and commercial interests were going to come to the field pretty soon. So it wasn't actually that soon, but 3 years later, on November 19th, I guess the New York Times got tipped off the day before. You can see this was November 18th. So November 19th, 2004, I think it was a year out of library school, just a few days before my birthday, Google Scholar launched. And that was 2004. And really for the first time, this is actually an image from the Wayback Machine. Sometimes it's hard to tell if it's Wayback Machine or it's the actual what's going on right now with Google, because it changes so little over time in some ways, although it has arguably changed a lot in the last few years. So really for the first time with lots of limitations, one of which was Elsevier wasn't in there yet, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for the first time, researchers had this sort of single search option where everything was in one consolidated index, and you got a unified results list. This is the lead developer. He actually co-developed it, Anurag Acharya, seen here at an innovative user group meeting, literally being cornered by librarians. You can see there. Poor guy. It looks like he kind of stumbled in from a hike or something. He was looking for some water. He's like, hey, I don't want any trouble. He built Google Scholar with two other people. 3 people built Google Scholar, and currently, apparently, there's only one half-time person dedicated to the development and maintenance of Google Scholar. So these few people, obviously building on Google's massive infrastructure, really changed the game. So 3 people, and this reminds me of the talk, the panel yesterday about innovation and the ability to create things. Speaking of which, Scholars Portal gave an update the same year that Google Scholar launched. Progress has been very slow, said the 2000 report from the University of Southern California. Reasons included internal resource allocation issues. I'm not sure what that was code for, but probably someone was pissed off with somebody else at the time. Delays due to the managed service contract, getting Shibboleth to work, and wanting to perform a user evaluation study in a controlled environment. And I think we can all sort of understand these kind of limitations within our system, which as a whole has a lot of capacity, but we have some challenges when it comes to doing stuff quickly. This is what library.org looks like right now. Don't send any of your students here. It's basically a spam site. So it didn't really go very far. And this is what the USC Libraries homepage looks like now. You can see that Summon is very prominent, and you'll see actually a link sort of adjacent to Summon to Scholars Portal, which is actually still there. It's underneath the link to Google Scholar. but it actually links to a Serial Solutions product. To our credit, even though library.org never really went anywhere, we've long understood the need to create interfaces to search across, our multiple silos. Z3950 has a history dating back to the 1970s. It's still alive and well, apparently. But it was really an attempt to do that, to broadcast search out to multiple targets. So if you had maybe more than 10, it didn't work so well. But and then metasearch came along, which sort of worked on the same basic principle, but with some pretty serious limitations in terms of the time getting the results back and unified results list. Then along came Google Scholar, and the idea of a centralized index was we all kind of realized it was a much better approach than sort of broadcast federated searching. And again, there was a call in library land, just like in library land. I'm not sure what that might look like in some of our imaginations, but it might actually include, is that Ellen on the screen there behind Marshall? I don't know. She might be there. I was trying to figure out who that was. But anyway, in 2005, so this is a year after Google Scholar launched, Marshall Breeding, who you see there, and many of you are familiar with his work and know him. As large forces at Google began to step into the arena of scholarly information, it seems important for the library community to be proactive. The stakes are high enough for us to move aggressively toward providing better search interfaces. So again, another call for us to do something about this. And because 3 people at Google did it pretty quickly, I think some people said, hey, why can't we do this? It was 4 more years before the first sort of consolidated index product built specifically for libraries came to market, and that was Summon in 2009. It had now been a full decade since library.org and Scholars Portal idea had been articulated. We finally had our product. It had come from a vendor in many ways as a rearguard action against Google and Google Scholar. So was it ever realistic to expect us as a community to build something like this? And I think you can get partway to the answer by looking at what our critiques were of Google Scholar when it initially launched. And a lot of that stuff, a lot of those critiques were generally based on things like metadata inadequacies, content issues, transparency issues with what was being indexed, the use of standards and things like that. These are all really important things to consider, and especially for us because we love doing that. But they arise, I think, from a culture of perfection where we're really quite uncomfortable with the idea of beta. And Google Scholar was in beta for years and years and years. They just let it go out there. And it arises from a culture that for a really long time has been consistently focused on documents and metadata. You can see here the documents and it's sort of like the users are kind of scurrying around the stuff that's really important, which is the content there, right? And I think Carol Kuhlthau really nails it. This is one of the most highly cited papers in library and information science, where she basically says information systems and the intermediaries who manage them, and this was back in 1991, so those intermediaries, us in other words, have traditionally been driven by a bibliographic paradigm centered on collecting and classifying texts, right? The bibliographic paradigm is based on certainty and order. I know I like certainty and order. Whereas users' problems are characterized by uncertainty and confusion. I think Andrew really nailed that. Like people there's a lot of anxiety and confusion when you're first starting your research. And Google thrives on uncertainty and confusion. It thrives on making sense of that stuff. That's where its billions and billions of dollars come from. And as a result, they really focus on a user. Can you imagine going to a library page and clicking about the library and seeing something like this? I mean, most of them, we talk about how big our collections are. There's a picture of the university librarian and things like that. So, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a different kind of culture. So even though Google Scholar wasn't perfect when it launched, it still launched, and it did very well. It did actually so well that we started to kind of question what our role was in information retrieval, and I think it really spooked us. To the extent that when library-specific discovery tools actually came along, we were pretty anxious to embrace them. And we opened our hearts and our wallets. So this is, again, from Marshall Breeding. He didn't have any information on EDS with the EBSCO Discovery Service. These are sort of the 4 big products that pre-index and consolidate things. Marshall Breeding notes, and he does this yearly review of library automation and library journal, as many of you know. He notes that the fact that we spend such an enormous amount on our collections necessitates that we provide a simple means to access those collections. So we're kind of forced into buying these products, not forced, but we're anxious to buy products that provide simple access to our very expensive collections. And these products, these web-scale discovery, I won't spend too much time on this. This is basically how they work. They single search box, user enters a term. It's up against a consolidated index. Results come back in a unified list that you can facet based on things like subject, date, type of resource, that sort of thing. And thanks to Marshall for letting me use this slide. I asked him, and within about 30 seconds he replied back, yeah, that's great. Many of us feature them prominently as part of our websites. This is the UVic library. This is our new website that I just spent 7 months on. But it was a good time. I know that many, actually check it out on your iPads. It's got responsive design. It's really cool. And many of our sites look like this, right? So we're really, search is front and center. And there's lots of reasons for that. But it certainly isn't to the satisfaction of everyone. Here's some feedback we received. The new site gives some a monopoly on search, and this isn't necessarily a good thing. Anonymous English faculty member. This is a sentiment I think shared by a lot of librarians too, and I think it's a valid concern. And actually, we're gonna dig into that concern a little bit later, and the risk that we run by selling discovery like this so hard. But it's certainly true that not all faculty disapprove, although most of them still start their research in discipline-specific databases. You can see in the most recent U.S. faculty survey from Ithaca that the library catalog, which is the third sort of section there, has actually seen an increase in use. And the authors of that study opine that it's basically a new crop of discovery tools that's really potentially driving that increased usage. So things like SUM and like WorldCat Local are arguably bringing faculty back into the fold a little bit. You notice that actually on that previous, some of them actually come into the building. Not very many though. I saw one sort of dazed and confused wandering around the other day. I think he thought he was somewhere else, but and we're seeing pretty good use of this product actually by faculty and by students at UVic. Between September last year and this year, there were almost 600,000 visits to Summon, with a total closing in on total number of searches closing in on 3 million, which is pretty good. I think Google probably gets that in about 30 seconds or so, but that's a lot of searches. That's a lot of use. Okay. So from 1999, when library.org was first kind of articulated in Keystone, single search has become a reality. It didn't happen. We didn't build it, but it happened nonetheless. During the same period, open access has gone from theory to reality too. In 2001, there was the same year that Jerry Campbell white paper came out on the need for a scholars portal. There was a, quote, small but lively meeting convened in Budapest by the Open Society Foundation in order to accelerate progress in the international effort to make research articles in all academic fields freely available on the internet. So this was the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which many of us have heard about. And in the 12 years since that meeting, a lot has changed, actually. I was rather surprised when I started digging into it. Open access has really gone from fringe to mainstream. There's a report commissioned by the EU this year that, according to their analysis, there was a tipping point reached in December 2012 where a majority of scholarly papers in total, now it's not true for every country and for every discipline, but in total, a majority became freely available online, which I think is a really profound movement for us as librarians. Things really appear to be moving quickly than most of us actually thought. Back to faculty, they're using this freely available content. So if they don't find it through the library, they get it freely online. That's their second largest source of content, and it's my somewhat considered opinion, although it's never that considered, that this freely available content, it's pretty soon, if it hasn't actually already, going to surpass just in volume, and I'm talking high quality academic content, not just fringy stuff, but it's going to surpass the stuff that we actually pay for in total volumes. And it's important to point out that discovery tools that we pay a lot of money for were designed around surfacing content that was mostly paid for, mostly subscription-based stuff. So how are these tools going to deal with this increase in open access content that's really sort of coming at us in a wave for a variety of reasons, mostly because public funders are demanding it? And it gets kind of complicated. There's gold open access, where an entire journal or group of journals, every article is available freely. There's green open access, where something might not be free at first, but 12 months later, or 6 months later, or 48 months later, after an embargo period has passed, it's made free. There's hybrid journals, so you have journals where certain articles within that journal are free. And then you have things like institutional repositories, where authors post their preprints or postprints or author manuscripts and all that sort of stuff. So as Christine Stone at Ex Libris said, things are getting richer and more diverse. It's a little pinpoint of where their headquarters is in the Jerusalem Technology Park. But they're also getting a lot more challenging to track. Kind of looks like Vancouver. It's actually HSBC's headquarters in Hong Kong, and they put out a report recently where they basically the report was on academic publishing. They surveyed research funders, so these are the people that are really driving these decisions, that are handing out 80% of research funding around the world, about 1% of which actually ends up in libraries in the form of subscriptions. They surveyed research funders. They talked to these people, and they came away with a view that reinforced their earnings-neutral transition to open access. So basically, quote, the principle that taxpayers should not have to pay twice for research and that research should therefore be available for free at the point of use does not mean that publishers lose the ability to charge for that stuff. And what we're seeing publishers do is charging these article processing charges, or APCs, that range from $500 to $5,000 per article to make individual articles freely available. If an institution or a funder or a researcher isn't willing to pay that, there's generally an embargo period, so their research becomes freely available after a year or 6 months or whatever that might be. And embargoes are really intended to maintain subscription revenues. So HSBC has quite a rosy outlook on companies like Elsevier in particular. What this tells us is that both the nature of access will be more complicated, but also there's going to be a shift. So instead of all this money flowing into libraries in the form of subscriptions, some of that will still be flowing in, but a lot of it's going to be, we're going to move from subscriptions to sort of thousands or hundreds of thousands of researchers with these micropayments or APCs to individual publishers. And this has some pretty serious consequences, I think, for libraries. What it also means is that publishers, I think, especially the big commercial ones, are going to be a formidable market force, at least in the foreseeable future. Now, in terms of open access and discovery, and there's certainly a lot of stuff going on, and vendors like Serial Solutions, which owns some, and OCLC are doing a lot of stuff to pull open access into their indexes, into their search environments. Sorry, Andrew, I just put Nagy there. I meant Andrew Nagy. Sorry. And they do this in a number of ways, as far as I can tell. MARC records, obviously, from our catalog are harvested, as well as from records from institutional repositories and other digital collections. There are, of course, limits to this approach. MARC certainly doesn't have any sort of unambiguous fields that indicate open access availability, so you might get a record for a thesis in your discovery layer, but a user clicks on it, it's been restricted for the next 6 months or 12 months, so there's issues there. But it certainly does improve the discoverability of open access resources, especially in things like institutional repositories. And in terms of harvesting IRs in particular, this is actually quite important. I never really realized. I managed our instance of DSpace for a year, and it was kind of depressing. But at the end of the day, in aggregate, we're actually producing a lot of content through these kind of resources. According to one analysis of records in Site You Like, almost half of all content was available open access, and of that content, more than half actually came from digital collections from research libraries. So in aggregate, we're actually, as content providers, I wouldn't say publishers, but we're providing a lot of stuff to the network, actually a huge amount. We're going to get back to that in a minute. Another way you can do it is basically adding open access resources to knowledge bases, which are intricately entwined with discovery services. So for example, in Serious Solutions, this is a screenshot of I think KnowledgeWorks, and you can select things like Internet Archive, HathiTrust, open access journals, and many more. So you select these things, they appear in your results list in Summon or another discovery tool, and then you use either direct linking or in many cases OpenURL to resolve to the actual full text of the content. This works better for collections that are kind of unambiguously open access, so the whole thing is open. You don't get these complicated sort of embargoes or hybrid models. So hybrid journals and embargoes are still problematic in terms of this approach. And that's because links OpenURL, which obviously gets people in many cases from the discovery layer to the actual resources, is really premised on a traditional subscription model. So I'm going to just read really quickly a quote from this article by Chen that most recently came out in Journal of Web Librarianship. It is not possible for libraries to activate selected articles from a certain issue of a journal. For example, an NIH, that's a National Institutes of Health funded article, is from the journal Molecular Cell, which requires a subscription or payment to view most of its articles, but that specific article is freely available from various websites, including the publisher site, an institutional repository, and PubMed Central. Without a subscription to Molecular Cell, there's no way for an OpenURL link resolver to allow a library to selectively activate only that NIH-funded article from Molecular Cell. So you can see some of the issues that we're starting to run into with open access and discovery. And OpenURL certainly isn't cutting it in a lot of cases, and its long-term viability will require a look at how to deal with embargo periods and hybrid journals especially. Back to our old friend Google Scholar. Doesn't really have a problem with this kind of complexity, arguably anyway. It data mines publishers' corpuses just like our discovery tools do, but it also crawls the open web, and our discovery tools don't do that. So it does a much better job at surfacing open access content. It's through a feature many people initially especially called kind of subversive, where it'll sort of index publishers' content and then crawl the open web and look for free versions of that content. It doesn't really care where those are from, and it'll provide a link to a particular PDF in a deduplicated result. So in this way, Google Scholar is also really good at finding free versions of papers from institutional repositories, author websites, some sites that are kind of sketchy, but either way, it's getting users to free versions of this content. Just checking my timer here. In order to deal with some of these issues, vendors and publishers and librarians are working together on initiatives like this NISO initiative to develop open access metadata indicators, which basically would provide some metadata that came along with individual articles or journals about the availability of those articles. So aggregators and service providers currently have no single mechanism for identifying articles that can be legitimately harvested that are open access that aren't included in your subscription resources. So if this initiative is successful, it should make it a lot easier for vendors to work directly with publishers to make open access articles from hybrid journals more discoverable. Right now it's kind of an ad hoc thing. I know that Ex Libris has worked with Oxford and others. It's pretty resource intensive to work with individual publishers, so standardization looks kind of promising in this particular area. Okay, so shift gears a little bit here. speaking of publishers, when we look ahead at the future of search, I think publishers are going to play a huge, potentially a huge role, especially the big commercial publishers. I think they have search and discovery very much in mind as they move forward in terms of strategic goals and directions. On April 8th this year, Elsevier announced that it had acquired reference management software Mendeley, or the reference management site. So what does this have to do with the future search? Well, at least for large commercial publishers, there's a convincing argument to be made that there will be a transition from sort of primarily library subscription revenue model to a mix of article processing charges and subscriptions. Open access might mean free to access for the end user, but it certainly doesn't mean free to publish. But this is really just for the individual articles or documents, and as we've seen, we've always been really focused on those actual artifacts. The future direction of search and discovery, however, I think is going to move far beyond the simple discovery of individual documents via centralized index. And Elsevier's purchase of Mendeley kind of hints at this, I think. And they paid a lot of money for it, too. In fact, what we're likely going to see, and what we're already seeing in certain areas, is a move from content as revenue to knowledge discovery as revenue, where platforms like Mendeley they overlay a body of content that is increasingly free to access via open access. But it's those platforms that overlay it and those services that overlay it that it's what we're going to be actually paying for. Of course, for Elsevier and other publishers, content will continue to play a really important part in their revenue. But the purchase of Mendeley, I think, hints at a place where they can charge both these article processing charges for subscriptions and more and more charge for the platforms that add value to the research process. This is Victor Henning, who looks like he's about 14, but isn't. He's the CEO of Mendeley, and he's now Vice President of Strategy at Elsevier, so don't mess with this guy, okay? He was asked in a recent interview in The Guardian, what you're building sounds initially like a citation index. This is about Mendeley. What's your new wrinkle on that? The interview asked. The new idea was, this is his answer, the new idea was that instead of having a central crawler like Google or a centrally curated index which depends on ingesting content, we thought if we could get hundreds of thousands or millions of scientists to use our software, each document would come with a layer of social information about who's interested in this particular research, what are the papers being read this week. So you introduce this idea of collaborative filtering, that's what he called it. And because there's so much information available, and you hear this from researchers all the time, they're absolutely overwhelmed, retrieval of documents via keyword searching of a centralized index, it places a lot of burden, obviously, on the algorithm itself, but the user as well has to figure things out and filter things out, and it's pretty hard work. It's challenging, and it takes a lot of time, and time is what researchers don't have. They're competing for ever increasingly competitive research grants. They don't want to spend a day on Web of Science and then Google Scholar and then Summon. Maybe some of them do. I don't know. But this is an example of another Elsevier product. Check out that stethoscope, by the way. That's somebody actually built that thing. Probably just imagine the photo shoot. Okay, just sort of place the stethoscope. Okay. I don't think there's actual wind blowing there. I think that tie probably has a wire in it. This product is billed as the next generation online search tool that provides physicians with smarter, faster clinical answers. So basically, content is tagged with a proprietary taxonomy that allows the engine to understand clinical terms. So we're entering in here on sort of the semantic search realm. You not only get results from your keywords, but you get related terms. You bring together meaningful topics as entities, which enables researchers to see new connections between topics. So even if all the content they index is free in a product like this, which increasingly because of open access mandates from major biomedical research funders in the US, it might be, even if all that content is free, Elsevier's proprietary taxonomy that drives this whole thing certainly isn't. It's anything but free. And that's really where the value is, like with Mendeley and extra layers of information which new discovery platforms can be built upon. So we're moving away from, and Andrew mentioned this yesterday, we're moving away from strings, in other words, keywords entered into a single search box which are matched with similar strings in a consolidated index. moving towards an environment where entities are recognized by search products, entities like people or topics or pharmaceutical drugs. And this is the basis for what's been termed semantic search and the Google's knowledge graph. I'll just call it the Google. Knowledge graph is probably the most famous example. Google explains it this way. Language can be ambiguous. Do you mean Rio, the city, the movie, or the casino? With the knowledge graph, Google can help understand the difference, helping you express more precisely what you mean as you enter your search. So in this particular case, sorry, I didn't change the slides there. You have to stare at that stethoscope when you could be staring at meatloaf, which is a much... so in this particular case, I do a search for meatloaf. The knowledge graph sort of comes up on the right-hand side there to try to help me disambiguate my my search. Do I meatloaf the dish or meatloaf the guy? Of course, I meant meatloaf the guy. And I click on that, and it just gives me results based on that. You can see this kind of functionality coming in the world of library discovery tools too. Andrew showed some previews of Summon 2.0. We've got a preview site at UVic or Summon Library. Here's a screenshot, and sort of the example search is you search for heart attack, but myocardial infarction comes up even though the results there don't contain that specific keyword because there's been some topic disambiguation or automated query expansion, which boosts relevance even when the users don't know all the right keywords to use. So this is the idea of topics and entities and keywords related to them. And you can get some services related to those specific topics, like recommendations for libguides. I know we all love libguides, right, everyone? Or subject librarians, and we do all love subject librarians. Those recommendations aren't powered necessarily by the search terms you're using. They're powered by topics that are related to those specific search terms. So we're moving increasingly from strings to things via semantic search technology. I think discovery is going to be increasingly about honing in on research trends and relationships and social information that kind of wrap around these collections of documents that are going to make the documents themselves really valuable at an aggregate level. And at the end of the day, it's really about making research more effective. This is what people are concerned with. Whether it accomplishes that is another question. When you survey publishers, which the Publishing Research Consortium did in 2011, they see this coming and they understand that semantic tagging to drive new applications is strategically extremely important for publishers right now, especially the large commercial publishers. Those are actually the publishers that can afford to do it. People also recognize in the publishing community that it's going to be really really expensive and hard to do, and that's why I think we'll see people like Elsevier and other players really out front on this because it's expensive. So in case you were worried, I think Elsevier is going to be okay. I think they're going to be fine, just in case any of you are worried. They're still going to be making lots of money, and they're going to remain a competitive force, obviously, which is not necessarily good news for products like Summon. And the reason I think that is because initially Google Scholar and Summon too were denied access to content for I think about 2 years after both of those products launched from Elsevier. And according to that same PRC survey that I just mentioned, the most common reason why publishers deny access for data mining is that outside commercial interests, or basically that people who are data mining are going to build a competing product. It's not sort of until the equation tips towards, okay, that competing product is now driving traffic in a way that's beneficial that they really change. And often it's a wait-and-see attitude, I think, too. But when driving traffic to content is less important because that content might have already been paid for or available freely online, the importance of the platform and the services around that platform might arguably increase, right? So it's not so much about the content, it's about the platform. And it's kind of similar to the relationship between A&I products and discovery, where you see discovery products are often viewed as substitutes to A&I products, and so they don't play nicely together often. As actual content and individual documents become arguably less important because of open access, and as publishers focus more and more on the knowledge creation that content can drive through these new platforms, and these platforms sort of proliferate. Where does this leave library discovery products? So as platforms like Summon become more sophisticated, and they certainly are doing that, Will they be seen increasingly as substitutes or competitors in the eyes of publishers that are actually providing this content and that are strategically moving in a direction where their platforms are going to be really important to them? And this is especially true for very well-funded or rich publishers like Elsevier. Perhaps more importantly, especially for my 3-year-old, where does this leave libraries? I'm not actually that worried about it, but Google and Google Scholar directly compete for our users in terms of discovery. I think we can all admit that. Before the really big growth of open access, Google Scholar wasn't as big of a threat because we always sort of served as that, to serve as kind of the last mile, it's called, right? So even if you use Google Scholar, eventually you had to use us because you had to get to that content, and that content was expensive. That content more and more and more is going to be free. Open access changes the equation. There's also the question about article processing fees and the defunding of libraries. So, if a lot of our money, I think half of our budget at UVic is for subscription, is to basically buy stuff. So as that money moves away from subscriptions and more towards article processing fees, what's that going to do to libraries? Well, maybe we'll get to pay for those platforms. Maybe we'll be happy to do it. Will discovery be increasingly outsourced to Google and publishers? And interesting, I think Victor Henning, the 16-year-old CEO of Mendeley, might be able to point us in the right direction. So he said, and I'm going to quote from him sort of a little bit at length, but I think it's really, really important. It's very insightful. Libraries serve several purposes, he says. They provide access to information by being a central point of purchase, right? We're a buying club, basically, as John Durno would say. If open access becomes the standard mode of accessing content, libraries would not need to fulfill that task anymore. We would rather, as researchers, rely on centralized databases and search engines like Mendeley, obviously Scopus and Google Scholar and others. But libraries also serve another purpose, which is preserving and archiving information. Particularly at research institutions that produce their own output, libraries will be needed to preserve and disseminate that information. So libraries should not be insular, but partners with platforms like Mendeley and others. So remember, as a whole, we're producing a lot of content, and we could actually be producing a lot more content and metadata that can be contributed to the network. So perhaps this is where we should be focusing our scarce resources in things like digitization initiatives, in getting our bibliographic information on the web in a meaningful way. Perhaps that's through RDF. Dale, I'm quoting you here, so you might want to look up. That's good. Some think we shouldn't be focusing on discovery as much as we do, especially as open access continues to gain ground and semantic search enables whole new kinds of discovery. And I think this is what Dale might have been getting to in his recent post on the Tega forum called Giving Up on Discovery. I think that would make Victor Henning pretty happy too. So we focus on sort of providing content and getting that stuff into the network and don't worry too much about discovery. Let Google do it. They know how to do it, and they're doing it successfully. Considering someone's popularity at UVic, this isn't obviously going to happen anytime soon, but it's worth considering whether our websites, as they move to looking more and more like a Google search engine with a single search box, it's worth considering where our scarce resources are going in that particular direction. So special thanks to Andrew Nagy and Christine Stoll from Ex Libris, who took the time to talk to me via email and informed a lot of this presentation. Thanks, everyone.